The house, the woman, even the greenhouse. None of it was mine.
The first time I saw my wife Erica kissing another man, I was holding a cup of coffee that cost more than most people's lunch. The irony wasn't lost on me, standing in my own greenhouse at midnight, watching my marriage crumble through glass walls I'd paid for with money she didn't even know I had. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, when I still believed in things like trust and happily ever after. My name is David Locke, and for 37 years, I've perfected the art of being underestimated. It's a useful skill, especially when you're sitting on a fortune that would make most people's heads spin. Environmental engineering doesn't sound glamorous, and I've cultivated that image carefully. Flannel shirts, sensible cars, the kind of guy who fixes his own plumbing and knows the difference between topsoil and potting mix. The mansion tells a different story, but most people don't pay attention to details. They see the peeling paint on the shutters, the moss growing on the north side, the way the wrought iron fence leans slightly to the left after last winter's storm. What they don't see is the solid foundation beneath. The bones of old money that built this place when Charleston was still finding its feet after the Civil War. Erica saw the house when we met 5 years ago, but she saw it through the lens of someone who grew up in a double-wide in Somerville. To her, any house with more than 4 rooms and a chandelier was practically Versailles. She moved in with the enthusiasm of someone who'd won the lottery, which, in a way, she had. She just didn't know how big the jackpot really was. "Dave, honey, the caterer needs to know about dietary restrictions for Saturday's party," Erica called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was managing my life. I told them mostly standard stuff, but should I mention anything about the Hendersons? You know how Martha gets about gluten? I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been reviewing environmental impact reports that would bore most people to tears but represented millions in city contracts. Whatever you think is best, it's your show. And it was. Erica had transformed herself from small-town PR consultant to Charleston's rising social coordinator with the kind of determination that was admirable and slightly terrifying. Our house had become the venue of choice for charity fundraisers, political mixers, and the kind of parties where people wore their tax brackets like jewelry. The irony was that most of these events benefited causes I actually funded through a network of trusts and foundations that dated back to my grandfather's textile fortune. But Erica didn't know about the money, not the real money. She thought I made a decent living testing water quality and filing reports with the city. She had no idea that the environmental consulting firm was more of a hobby, or that the Locke family name was carved into half the buildings in the historic district. I'd kept it that way deliberately. Growing up wealthy teaches you things about human nature that you can't unlearn. It teaches you the difference between people who like you and people who like your bank account. Erica had fallen in love with Dave, the engineer, who drove a 10-year-old Honda and knew how to fix a leaky faucet. I wanted to keep it that way. "Oh, and Simon Vance called about the greenhouse project," she added, appearing in the doorway with her phone in one hand and a glass of wine in the other. "He wants to discuss some changes to the design." Simon Vance. If there was a human equivalent of fool's gold, it would be Simon. All shine and no substance, with the kind of manufactured charm that worked on people who didn't look too closely. He'd appeared in our social circle about 6 months ago, calling himself an eco-entrepreneur and talking big about sustainable development and green energy solutions. I'd done my research, of course. Simon's company, Eden Enterprises, was mostly smoke and mirrors, a few small solar installations, and a lot of glossy brochures. But he had the look that impressed people at cocktail parties. 6'2", gym-built shoulders, teeth white enough to signal aircraft, and the kind of confident handshake that made you forget to ask about his actual credentials. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I was more interested in the way Erica's cheeks had flushed slightly when she mentioned his name. "Technical stuff, something about the irrigation system and maybe adding some climate control features." He said it would be better to discuss it in person. The greenhouse had been Erica's idea, a wedding anniversary gift to myself that she'd suggested. A place where I could indulge my interest in sustainable agriculture while giving her another venue for entertaining. It was beautiful, I had to admit. A Victorian-style conservatory that wouldn't have looked out of place at Kew Gardens, tucked into the back corner of our property where it caught the morning sun and stayed warm well into the evening. Simon had volunteered to help with the design, claiming expertise in controlled environment agriculture. I'd let him, partly because it made Erica happy, and partly because I was curious to see what he was really after. Men like Simon always wanted something. It was just a matter of time before I figured out what. Sure, I said. Set up a meeting whenever works for him. Erica smiled, the kind of bright, grateful smile that used to make my chest tighten with affection. Now it just made me wonder what she wasn't telling me. You're the best, Dave. I know this stuff isn't really your thing, but it means a lot to me that you're supporting the project. She disappeared back into the kitchen and I returned to my laptop. But the words on the screen might as well have been hieroglyphics. My mind was elsewhere, picking at details that didn't quite fit together. Erica's late nights at client meetings. The way she'd started going to the gym religiously, coming home glowing with endorphins and talking about her trainer's innovative workout methods. The new clothes that appeared in her closet, designer pieces that cost more than her consulting business typically brought in. I'd been married long enough to recognize the signs, but I'd also been wealthy long enough to know that suspicion without proof was just paranoia. Rich people, I'd learned, had a tendency to assume everyone was trying to take advantage of them. It was a lonely way to live, and I'd worked hard not to fall into that trap. But when your wife starts talking about another man's irrigation systems, with the kind of enthusiasm she used to reserve for weekend getaways, it's hard not to wonder what's really growing in the greenhouse. The first concrete evidence came from Mrs. Jean, our housekeeper, though she didn't realize what she was telling me at the time. Mrs. Jean had worked for my family since before I was born, a tiny woman with steel gray hair and the kind of observational skills that would have made her a fortune as a private investigator. Mr. Dave, she said, appearing in my study with a basket of laundry and a disapproving expression, I found this in the pocket of that jacket Miss Erica asked me to clean. She held up a tube of lipstick, expensive by the look of it, with a gold case and a shade called Midnight Rose, according to the label. The problem was that Erica never wore dark colors. Her makeup routine was all pastels and neutrals, the kind of understated elegance that photographed well at charity events. Maybe she bought it for someone else, I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. Mrs. Jean's expression suggested she had opinions about that theory, but she was too professional to voice them. Of course, Mr. Dave, I just thought you should know. She left the lipstick on my desk and continued with her work, but I could feel her disapproval lingering in the air like expensive perfume. Mrs. Jean had never particularly liked Erica, though she'd been scrupulously polite about it. I'd always assumed it was simple class prejudice, the old family retainer disapproving of the boss's choice in wives. Now I wondered if her instincts had been better than mine. I slipped the lipstick into my desk drawer and tried to focus on work, but my concentration was shot. When Erica came home that evening, I watched her more carefully than I had in months. She was wearing her usual subtle pink gloss, the same shade she'd worn since our second date. Her clothes were expensive, but conservative. A silk blouse and tailored pants that looked like they'd come from the kind of boutique that didn't list prices on the tags. How was your day? I asked over dinner, the same question I'd been asking for 5 years. Busy, she said, cutting her salmon with surgical precision. I had lunch with the committee for the Children's Hospital fundraiser, then a meeting with the caterer for the environmental awareness dinner next month. Oh, and I stopped by the greenhouse to check on the progress. How's it looking? Amazing. Simon really knows what he's doing. He's installed this incredible misting system that keeps the humidity perfect, and he's talking about adding some kind of automated lighting that mimics natural sunlight patterns. Her eyes lit up as she talked, the same way they used to when she described our honeymoon plans or the house renovations we'd dreamed about. Sounds expensive, I said. Well, yes, but it's an investment, right? If we're going to do this, we might as well do it right. She paused, fork halfway to her mouth. You're not having second thoughts, are you? Because I could talk to Simon about scaling back some of the features. No, it's fine. I trust your judgment. And I did, which was part of the problem. I'd trusted Erica's judgment about a lot of things over the years. Our social calendar, the house renovations, the charities we supported. She had good instincts about people and events, a natural ability to navigate the complex social hierarchies of Charleston's upper crust. It was one of the things that had attracted me to her in the first place. But trust, I was beginning to realize, was like a foundation. It could support enormous weight for years, but once cracks started to show, the whole structure became suspect. After dinner, I retreated to my study and pulled out the lipstick again. Midnight Rose. It was the kind of color that made a statement bold and confident and slightly dangerous. I tried to imagine Erica wearing it and couldn't, but I could imagine someone else wearing it, someone who wanted to make an impression on a married woman's husband, or someone who wanted to make an impression on a married woman. I opened my laptop and did something I'd never done before. I Googled my wife. It felt like a violation, but so did finding another woman's lipstick in her jacket pocket. The search results were mostly what I expected: photos from charity events, mentions in the society pages, her consulting firm's website with its professional headshots and client testimonials. But buried in the results was something that made my stomach clench: a photo from last month's environmental symposium featuring Erica and Simon standing close together in front of a display about renewable energy. They weren't touching, weren't doing anything that would raise eyebrows in a newspaper, but there was something about their body language that felt intimate. The way she was leaning slightly toward him, the way his hand was positioned just behind her shoulder, not quite touching, but close enough to suggest familiarity. I stared at the photo for a long time, looking for innocent explanations. They were colleagues, after all, working together on the greenhouse project. It was natural that they'd be comfortable with each other. But the longer I looked, the more I saw things that bothered me. The way Erica's smile looked different, brighter, more genuine than the practiced expression she wore at most public events. The way Simon was looking at her instead of the camera, as if she were the most interesting thing in the room. I closed the laptop and poured myself a scotch, then sat in my leather chair and tried to think rationally. Suspicion wasn't proof. A lipstick and a photograph weren't evidence of an affair. But they were evidence of something. And that something was enough to keep me awake until well past midnight, listening to Erica's breathing in the bed beside me and wondering what secret she was keeping. The next morning brought rain and a phone call that changed everything. I was in the kitchen making coffee and watching the storm clouds gather over the harbor when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Project Eden Midnight Greenhouse. Come alone. I read it 3 times, my coffee growing cold in my hand. Project Eden, the same phrase I'd seen in some paperwork Simon had left behind after his last visit, though I hadn't paid much attention to it at the time. Now it felt significant, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't even known existed. I looked out the window toward the greenhouse, barely visible through the rain and morning mist. It looked innocent enough from here, just glass and steel and the green shadows of growing things. But appearances, I was learning, could be deceiving. That evening, I told Erica I had to work late, reviewing some environmental impact studies for a client. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have work to catch up on, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that I planned to be in my study with the lights off at midnight, watching the greenhouse and waiting to see who showed up for Project Eden. I didn't have to wait long. At 11:47 p.m., I watched Simon Vance's BMW pull into our driveway with its headlights off. He parked behind the oak tree that blocked the view from our bedroom window, a detail that suggested this wasn't his first clandestine visit to our property. I was positioned at my study window with a pair of binoculars I'd bought for bird watching, feeling like a character in one of those noir novels where the husband is always the last to know. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with humidity, and I could see Simon's breath misting in the cool night air as he made his way toward the greenhouse. He moved like someone who knew the path well, avoiding the loose flagstone that rocked underfoot and the motion sensor light that would have illuminated the back garden. These weren't details you'd pick up from a few daytime visits to discuss irrigation systems. At 11:52, I saw a second figure emerge from our house through the kitchen door. Even in the darkness, I recognized Erica's silhouette, the way she held her shoulders, the particular rhythm of her walk. She was wearing a dark robe that I'd never seen before, something silk and expensive that caught the moonlight as she moved. They met at the greenhouse entrance, and even from 50 yards away, I could see the familiarity in their greeting. Not the handshake of business associates or the polite hug of friends, but something more intimate. Simon's hand found the small of Erica's back as he opened the greenhouse door, a gesture that spoke of practice and comfort. I followed them with the binoculars as they moved into the greenhouse, their figures becoming shadowy and distorted through the glass walls. The automatic lighting system Simon had installed cast everything in a warm golden glow that made the scene look like something from a movie, romantic and surreal and completely devastating. What I saw next wasn't graphic or explicit, but it was unmistakable. The way Erica leaned into Simon as he showed her something on his tablet, the way his hand lingered on her shoulder, then moved to cup her face, the way she tilted her head back to look at him, her body language open and trusting in a way that I hadn't seen directed toward me in months. When they kissed, it wasn't the tentative exploration of a new relationship or the desperate passion of a forbidden affair. It was comfortable, familiar, the kind of kiss that spoke of shared secrets and private jokes and all the small intimacies that make up a real relationship. I watched for maybe 10 minutes, until I couldn't stand it anymore. Then I put down the binoculars and sat in my leather chair, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what I'd just witnessed. My wife was having an affair with Simon Vance in the greenhouse I'd paid for, using equipment he'd installed with money that ultimately came from my family's fortune. The irony was so complete, it was almost artistic. I could have confronted them right then, of course. Stormed out to the greenhouse and demanded explanations and apologies and all the other things that betrayed spouses are supposed to demand. But I'd spent 37 years learning patience, and the last 5 learning that Erica was more complicated than she appeared on the surface. If I was going to play this game, I was going to play it right. Instead, I went to my safe and retrieved a small digital camera I'd bought for documenting environmental damage at construction sites. It had excellent night vision capabilities and could record video in conditions that would challenge most equipment. I set it up at the study window, aimed at the greenhouse, and programmed it to start recording automatically whenever it detected motion in that area. Then I went to bed, slipping between sheets that still smelled like Erica's perfume, and pretended to be asleep when she came in 20 minutes later. "Dave," she whispered, settling into bed beside me. I made a sleepy noise that could have been acknowledgement or just unconscious movement. "I love you," she said, her voice soft and guilty in the darkness. I didn't answer, but I filed the words away with everything else I was learning about my wife. People were complicated, I was beginning to understand. They could love you and betray you simultaneously, could mean their words even when their actions contradicted them completely. The next morning, Erica was unusually affectionate over breakfast, making my coffee the way I liked it, and asking about my plans for the day with the kind of attention she usually reserved for important clients. Guilt, I realized, made her a better wife in some ways. "I was thinking," she said, buttering toast with careful precision, "maybe we should plan a weekend getaway soon, just the 2 of us. We haven't done that in a while." "That sounds nice," I said, and meant it. Despite everything I'd seen the night before, part of me still loved the woman sitting across from me. Love, it turned out, wasn't something you could turn off like a light switch, even when you had evidence that it wasn't being returned. "I'll look into some options," she said, brightening. "Maybe somewhere coastal. You always liked the ocean." After she left for her morning appointments, I retrieved the camera and reviewed the footage from the night before. The quality was better than I'd hoped, clear enough to make out faces and body language, detailed enough to leave no doubt about what was happening. I saved the files to an encrypted drive and hid it in my safe, next to the legal documents that Erica didn't know existed. Then I called Felix Morrison, my lawyer and one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial situation. "Dave," Felix said, his voice carrying the particular warmth he reserved for clients who paid their bills on time and never called with emergencies. "What can I do for you?" "I need to discuss some personal matters," I said. "Can we meet this afternoon?" "Of course. Everything all right?" "I'm not sure yet, but I want to be prepared for various scenarios." Felix had been handling my family's legal affairs for 15 years, and he was too professional to ask for details over the phone. We arranged to meet at his office at 3 o'clock, which gave me time to organize my thoughts and evidence. I spent the morning reviewing financial documents and making notes about Erica's recent behavior. The late nights, the new clothes, the way she'd started talking about Simon with the kind of enthusiasm she used to reserve for our anniversary dinners. Building a case, I realized, even though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. At Felix's office, I laid out everything I knew and suspected. The lipstick, the photograph, the midnight meetings in the greenhouse. Felix listened without judgment, taking notes in his precise handwriting and asking clarifying questions that helped me see the situation more clearly. "What do you want to do?" he asked when I finished. "I'm not sure yet, but I want to understand my options." Felix pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across his desk. "In terms of divorce proceedings, South Carolina is a no-fault state, but adultery can still affect property division and alimony. Given the prenup you signed, Erica would be entitled to a significant settlement, but not half of your assets." I'd forgotten about the prenup, actually. Erica had insisted on it before our wedding, claiming she wanted to protect both of us from any appearance of gold digging. At the time, I'd been touched by her consideration. Now I wondered if she'd had different motives. However, Felix continued, there's something you should know about your wife's recent activities. I've been monitoring some business filings as part of my general due diligence, and it appears that Eden Enterprises has applied for several grants from environmental foundations, grants that would typically go through your approval process. He handed me a stack of papers that made my blood pressure spike. Simon's company had applied for nearly $200,000 in funding from 3 different foundations, all of which were controlled by trusts that I managed. The applications were professionally prepared and cited inside knowledge of local environmental priorities that wasn't publicly available. Someone's been sharing information, I said. It appears that way, and if that someone is your wife, it could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty, depending on how she obtained the information. I stared at the grant applications, seeing my marriage in a new light. Had Erica been working with Simon from the beginning? Was the affair a byproduct of their business relationship? Or had the business relationship been a cover for something more personal? I need more information, I said. Can you have someone look into Eden Enterprises, financial records, business relationships, anything that might help me understand what I'm dealing with? Felix nodded and made more notes. I'll have a report for you by the end of the week. In the meantime, I'd suggest documenting everything you can without putting yourself at legal risk. And Dave, be careful. If they're willing to commit grant fraud, they might be willing to do other things to protect their interests. I left Felix's office with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a cheating wife anymore. It was about people using my trust and my money to fund their own schemes, and that was something I couldn't ignore. That evening, I watched Erica prepare for another client dinner with the kind of attention I usually reserved for environmental surveys. She chose her clothes carefully. A black dress that was elegant but not flashy, jewelry that was expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of outfit that would photograph well at a business function but could also transition easily to something more intimate. "Don't wait up," she said, kissing my cheek with lips that tasted like the pink gloss she'd been wearing for 5 years. "These planning committee meetings can run late." "Of course," I said. "I'll probably be working in the study anyway." After she left, I set up the camera again and settled in to wait. But this time, I wasn't just gathering evidence of an affair. I was building a case for something much more serious, and I was beginning to understand that the stakes were higher than I'd originally thought. At midnight, Simon's BMW appeared again, followed by the familiar ritual of clandestine meetings and intimate conversations in the greenhouse I'd paid for. But now I was watching with different eyes, looking for business documents and financial discussions along with the personal betrayal. What I saw was worse than I'd expected. They weren't just lovers. They were partners in the fullest sense of the word. Partners in business, partners in deception, and partners in a scheme that was designed to separate me from my money while keeping me ignorant of their true relationship. I recorded everything, saved the files, and began planning my response. Because if Erica and Simon wanted to play games with my trust and my fortune, I was going to show them what happened when you underestimated a man who'd been hiding his true resources for 37 years. Planning a proper revenge requires patience, attention to detail, and a thorough understanding of your opponent's weaknesses. Fortunately, I'd spent 5 years studying Erica's social ambitions and 6 months watching Simon's desperate attempts to project success, so I had plenty of material to work with. The key insight came from Felix's investigator, a former FBI agent named Patricia Chen, who specialized in financial fraud cases. Her report on Eden Enterprises was a masterpiece of forensic accounting that revealed Simon's operation for what it really was, an elaborate shell game designed to extract money from environmental grants while providing minimal actual services. "Your Mr. Vance is running a classic long con," Patricia explained during our meeting at Felix's office. "He identifies wealthy individuals or organizations with environmental interests, establishes relationships with people who have access to funding decisions, then submits professionally prepared grant applications that cite inside information to demonstrate expertise." She spread several documents across the conference table, each one representing a different aspect of Simon's scheme. "He's done this before in Atlanta and Savannah, always the same pattern. Find a wealthy mark, seduce someone with access to their financial networks, extract what he can, then move on when the situation becomes untenable. And Erica? Patricia's expression was professionally neutral, but I could see sympathy in her eyes. Based on the timeline, it appears she was targeted specifically because of her relationship to you. The affair began approximately 2 weeks after Eden Enterprises filed its first grant application. That's not a coincidence. I stared at the timeline she'd prepared, seeing my marriage mapped out in terms of financial exploitation and emotional manipulation. It was worse than simple adultery. It was calculated, predatory, and designed to use Erica's feelings as a tool against me. "What's my best course of action?" I asked. Felix leaned forward, his lawyer instincts engaging. "We could file criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. The evidence is solid, and the amounts involved are substantial enough to warrant serious prosecution." But I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "But that would expose your financial situation publicly and create exactly the kind of media attention you've spent years avoiding. It would also put Erica in legal jeopardy, which might not be what you want if you believe she's more victim than accomplice." I considered this for a long moment, weighing justice against privacy, revenge against mercy. Erica had betrayed me, but she'd also been manipulated by someone who made a living out of exploiting people's emotions and ambitions. "There's another option," Patricia said quietly. "We could expose the scheme publicly in a way that destroys their credibility and recovers your money without involving criminal prosecution. It would require some theater, but it would be more surgical." "What kind of theater?" She smiled, and I caught a glimpse of why she'd been successful at the FBI. "The kind that uses their own ambitions against them. Mr. Vance wants to be seen as a successful entrepreneur, and your wife wants to be accepted by Charleston society. We could arrange for them to get exactly what they think they want, right up until the moment it destroys them." The plan that emerged from our discussions was elegant in its simplicity. We would give Simon and Erica an opportunity to overreach, to commit themselves so completely to their deception that retreat would be impossible. Then we would expose them at the moment of their greatest apparent triumph, using their own words and actions as evidence of their betrayal. The vehicle for this plan would be the annual Environmental Leadership Gala, a charity event that Erica had been organizing for months. It was scheduled for the following Saturday at our house, with over 200 guests including city officials, business leaders, and representatives from every major environmental organization in the region. "It's perfect," Patricia explained. "Public enough to ensure maximum exposure, formal enough to attract media attention, and focused on exactly the issues that Simon claims to care about. If we're going to destroy his reputation, we might as well do it in front of everyone who matters." The first step was to ensure that Simon would be at the gala in a prominent role. This was easier than I'd expected. When I suggested to Erica that we should feature Eden Enterprises as one of our highlighted partners, she was enthusiastic about the idea. "That's brilliant, Dave," she said, her eyes lighting up with genuine excitement. "Simon has been working so hard on sustainable development projects, and this would be perfect exposure for his company." "I was thinking we could have him give a presentation about his work," I suggested. "Maybe during the dinner portion, when everyone's seated and paying attention." "He would love that. Should I ask him, or do you want to extend the invitation directly?" "Why don't you handle it? You know more about the program flow than I do." That evening, I watched from my study as Erica met with Simon in the greenhouse to discuss his presentation. They were animated and excited, clearly seeing this as a major opportunity to advance their scheme. Simon was gesticulating enthusiastically, probably describing the grants he planned to apply for after establishing his credibility at the gala. What they didn't know was that Patricia had already contacted the grant-making foundations and alerted them to the fraudulent applications. What they also didn't know was that I'd arranged for several investigative journalists to attend the gala, ostensibly to cover the environmental initiatives, but actually to witness Simon's public downfall. The second step was to gather additional evidence that could be presented dramatically during the event. This required some technical assistance from Patricia's contacts, but within a few days, we had audio recordings of Simon and Erica discussing their plans to extract money from my foundations. The conversations were incredibly revealing, Simon bragging about his ability to manipulate wealthy marks, and Erica providing detailed information about my financial networks. "The beautiful thing about rich guys like Dave," Simon said in one recording, "is that they're so isolated from normal people that they can't tell the difference between genuine affection and professional manipulation. Erica's got him completely wrapped around her finger." I do feel bad about it sometimes, Erica replied. He's not a bad person, just naive about relationships. But the money he's sitting on could fund real environmental projects if it were managed properly. That's what we're doing, Simon assured her. We're putting his resources to better use than he ever would. He'll probably thank us eventually. Listening to these conversations was like being dissected while conscious, but they also crystallized my resolve. This wasn't just about adultery or even financial fraud. It was about people who saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a human being worthy of basic respect. The final step was to prepare my own presentation for the gala. Ostensibly, I would be introducing Simon and explaining why Eden Enterprises was worthy of support from the environmental community. In reality, I would be laying out the evidence of their deception in front of an audience that included their intended victims. Felix helped me prepare the legal aspects of the presentation, ensuring that everything I planned to say was factually accurate and legally defensible. Patricia provided the technical support, arranging for audio and video equipment that would allow me to present the evidence clearly and dramatically. Remember, Felix cautioned during our final preparation meeting, once you do this, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over, your privacy will be compromised, and you'll be involved in a very public scandal. And if I don't do this, Simon and Erica will continue their scheme, probably targeting other wealthy individuals after they've extracted what they can from you. The pattern suggests they've done this before and will do it again. I thought about other men in other cities, sitting in their studies and wondering why their wives had grown distant, why their foundations were being approached by smooth-talking entrepreneurs with inside information about their interests. I thought about the genuine environmental organizations that would be denied funding because resources were being diverted to fraudulent schemes. Then we do this, I said. Saturday night, in front of everyone who matters. The week leading up to the gala was surreal. Erica threw herself into the preparations with the kind of energy she usually reserved for major life events, coordinating caterers and decorators and musicians with military precision. She was genuinely excited about the event, seeing it as her debut as a serious player in Charleston's social hierarchy. Simon, meanwhile, had been practicing his presentation with the dedication of a man who saw this as his big break. I occasionally heard him rehearsing in the greenhouse, his voice carrying across the garden as he described his vision for sustainable development and environmental leadership. The irony was that his presentation was actually quite good. He understood the issues, spoke eloquently about the challenges facing environmental organizations, and projected exactly the kind of passionate expertise that impressed donors and foundation boards. If he'd been legitimate, he would have been exactly the kind of partner I would have wanted to support. But he wasn't legitimate, and Saturday night, everyone would know it. The day of the gala dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the kind of elegant outdoor event that Erica had been planning. Our house looked magnificent. The gardens were immaculate, the lighting was professionally arranged, and the catering staff had transformed our dining room into something that belonged in a magazine. This is going to be perfect, Erica said, surveying the preparations with satisfaction. I think this might be the most important event we've ever hosted. She was right, though not in the way she imagined. As the guests began arriving that evening, I positioned myself near the entrance, greeting people and making small talk while internally rehearsing my presentation. Many of these people were friends, or at least friendly acquaintances, and after tonight, my relationships with all of them would be different. Simon arrived fashionably late, wearing an expensive suit and the kind of confident smile that had probably charmed dozens of victims over the years. He worked the crowd expertly, introducing himself to foundation representatives and city officials with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged in their world. "Dave," he said when he finally approached me, extending his hand with practiced warmth. "Thank you so much for this opportunity. I can't tell you how much it means to have your support." "I'm looking forward to your presentation," I replied, shaking his hand and looking directly into his eyes. "I think everyone here is going to learn something important tonight." He smiled and moved on, probably interpreting my words as encouragement. In a few hours, he would understand what I'd really meant. The moment of truth came at 9:30 p.m., after dinner had been served and the guests had settled into the comfortable anticipation that preceded the evening's featured presentation. I stood at the podium that had been set up in our main hall, looking out at 200 faces that represented the cream of Charleston's environmental and social establishment. Erica was seated at the head table, glowing with pride and anticipation. Simon sat beside her, radiating confidence and checking his notes one final time. They looked like the perfect power couple, united in their commitment to making the world a better place. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying easily through the sound system that Patricia's team had discreetly enhanced with recording equipment. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support environmental initiatives in our community. As you know, these causes are very close to my heart and to my family's heart." Polite applause rippled through the audience. I waited for it to subside, then continued. "Before we hear from tonight's featured speaker, I want to share some information about the Locke family's commitment to environmental causes. Many of you may not know that our involvement goes back 3 generations, beginning with my grandfather's establishment of the Palmetto Environmental Trust in 1962. I saw a few surprised looks in the audience. The Palmetto Trust was well known in environmental circles, but I'd never publicly acknowledged my family's connection to it before. Over the past 60 years, the Trust and its associated foundations have provided over $50 million in grants to environmental organizations throughout the Southeast. We've funded everything from wetlands restoration to renewable energy research, always with the goal of supporting legitimate, effective programs that make a real difference in our communities. The surprise was more widespread now. $50 million was serious money, even by Charleston standards. And the revelation that mild-mannered Dave Locke was connected to that kind of philanthropy was clearly news to most of the audience. "Which brings me to tonight's presentation," I continued, feeling my pulse quicken as I approached the crucial moment. "We're here to discuss a company called Eden Enterprises and its founder, Simon Vance, who has been seeking support from environmental foundations for his sustainable development projects." Simon straightened in his chair, probably assuming this was his cue to take the podium. Instead, I pressed a button on the laptop beside me, and the large screen behind me lit up with the first slide of my presentation. Over the past several months, Eden Enterprises has submitted grant applications to 3 foundations controlled by the Palmetto Trust. These applications demonstrate remarkable insight into our funding priorities and decision-making processes. They cite confidential information that isn't available to the general public, and they're written with the kind of insider knowledge that typically comes from years of involvement with our organizations. The slide showed copies of Simon's grant applications, with the confidential information highlighted in red. I heard murmurs from the audience as people recognized details that shouldn't have been accessible to outside applicants. Naturally, we were curious about how Mr. Vance had obtained this information, so we conducted an investigation. The next slide showed a timeline of Simon's relationship with Erica, correlated with his grant applications and his involvement in our social circle. The pattern was unmistakable. Every piece of insider information he'd used could be traced back to conversations or events that Erica had access to. I looked directly at Simon, whose confident expression was beginning to crack around the edges. "Mr. Vance, would you like to explain how you obtained confidential information from the Palmetto Trust's internal documents?" I'm not sure what you're referring to," Simon said, his voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system. "The information in those applications came from publicly available sources and my own research." "Really?" I pressed another button, and the screen filled with a transcript of one of the conversations Patricia had recorded, because we have audio evidence that suggests otherwise. The recording began to play, Simon's voice filling the room as he bragged about manipulating wealthy marks and using inside information to craft fraudulent grant applications. The audience listened in stunned silence as he described his scheme in his own words, complete with dismissive comments about my intelligence and character. That's taken out of context," Simon said, standing up from his chair. His face had gone pale, and I could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "Let's provide some context then," I said, advancing to the next slide. This one showed bank records that Patricia had obtained through legal channels, documenting payments from Simon's previous schemes in Atlanta and Savannah. Eden Enterprises has a history of targeting wealthy individuals with environmental interests. The pattern is always the same. Establish a relationship with someone who has access to funding decisions, extract confidential information, submit fraudulent grant applications, then disappear when the scheme is exposed. The murmurs from the audience were getting louder now, and I could see people turning to look at Simon with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. Several foundation representatives were taking notes, probably preparing to alert their colleagues about the attempted fraud. But Mr. Vance didn't work alone, I continued, feeling no satisfaction in what I was about to do. He had help from someone with intimate access to my personal and financial information, someone who attended foundation meetings, had access to confidential documents, and could provide the kind of insider knowledge that made his applications so convincing. I looked at Erica, who was staring at me with an expression of dawning horror. She'd realized where this was heading, but it was too late to stop it. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to hear a conversation that took place in my greenhouse 3 nights ago between Simon Vance and my wife, Erica Locke." The audio began playing, Erica's voice joining Simon's as they discussed their plans to extract money from my foundations. Her words were just as incriminating as his, casual references to my naive nature, detailed descriptions of foundation procedures, and explicit acknowledgement that they were defrauding organizations that trusted her. The silence in the room was absolute now, broken only by the sound of chairs creaking as people shifted uncomfortably. I watched Erica's face crumble as she heard her own words played back to an audience that included many of her social aspirations. "This is a private conversation taken without consent," she said, her voice barely audible. "You can't." "Actually, in South Carolina, I can record conversations that take place on my own property," I replied. "Especially when those conversations involve criminal conspiracy to commit fraud." I advanced to the final slide, which showed the total amount of money that Simon and Erica had attempted to steal, $847,000 across multiple grant applications, all based on confidential information that Erica had provided. "The good news," I said, addressing the audience rather than the 2 people whose lives I was systematically destroying, "is that none of these fraudulent grants were approved. The Palmetto Trust and its associated foundations have strict verification procedures that caught the discrepancies before any money changed hands." I paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected shock, disgust, and in some cases admiration for the thoroughness of my presentation. The better news is that this incident has helped us identify weaknesses in our application processes that we can address to prevent similar attempts in the future. We're committed to ensuring that environmental funding goes to legitimate organizations that can make a real difference in our communities. I closed the laptop and stepped back from the podium, my presentation complete. The silence stretched for several seconds before someone in the back of the room began to applaud. Others joined in, and soon the entire audience was giving me a standing ovation, not for my speaking skills, but for my handling of a situation that could have cost the environmental community hundreds of thousands of dollars. Simon was already moving toward the exit, his face flushed with humiliation and anger. Several people tried to intercept him, probably foundation representatives who wanted to discuss his other pending applications, but he pushed past them and disappeared into the night. Erica remained seated, staring at her hands and probably contemplating the complete destruction of everything she'd worked to build in Charleston society. The women who had been her closest friends were looking at her with expressions of betrayal and disgust, realizing that their trust had been cruelly turned against their own community. As the applause died down, I made one final announcement. "The bar is still open, and the band will be playing for another hour. Please, continue to enjoy the evening and discuss ways we can work together to support legitimate environmental initiatives in our region." The crowd began to disperse, breaking into small groups that buzzed with conversation about what they'd just witnessed. Several foundation representatives approached me to discuss security measures and information sharing protocols. A few journalists who'd attended the event were already making phone calls, probably to editors who would want to know about the environmental fraud scheme that had been exposed at a Charleston Society gala. Felix appeared at my elbow, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes reflecting satisfaction at a job well done. "That was masterfully handled," he said quietly. "Clean, legal, and completely devastating. They'll never recover from this." "Good," I said and meant it. "What happens now?" "Simon will probably leave town within the week. His reputation in environmental circles is finished, and word will spread quickly to other cities. As for Erica..." He paused, glancing toward my wife, who was still seated at the head table like a statue. "That's up to you." I looked at Erica, feeling a complex mixture of emotions that I couldn't quite untangle. Love, betrayal, anger, pity. They were all there, competing for dominance in my chest. "We'll figure it out," I said, "but not tonight." The evening wound down gradually, with guests offering their congratulations and support as they departed. By 11:30, the caterers had cleaned up and the house was quiet again, leaving just Erica and me in the main hall where I'd destroyed our marriage 2 hours earlier. "I suppose you want me to leave," she said, finally looking up from her hands. "I want you to tell me the truth," I replied. "All of it. How long has this been going on? How much of our marriage was real? How much of this was your idea versus Simon's?" She was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was small and defeated. "It started as a business relationship. Simon approached me about getting introductions to environmental organizations, and I thought it was legitimate. He's very convincing when he wants to be. When did it become personal? About 3 months ago. He made me feel important, like I was contributing to something meaningful instead of just organizing parties for rich people." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I know how that sounds, given what you revealed tonight about your family's foundations, but I didn't know about any of that. You never told me. Would it have made a difference? I don't know. Maybe, probably." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "I do love you, Dave. I know you don't believe that now, but it's true. I love you and I betrayed you, and I don't know how to live with both of those things being true at the same time." I sat down beside her, suddenly exhausted by the evening's events and the emotional weight of everything that had led to this moment. "I believe you," I said. "That's what makes this so hard. I think you do love me in your way. But you also saw me as someone who could be used, someone whose trust could be exploited for your benefit. And I can't build a marriage on that foundation." We sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the remnants of the evening that had changed everything. Finally, Erica stood up and smoothed her dress, trying to restore some dignity to her appearance. "I'll pack some things and stay at my mother's for a while," she said. "We can work out the details later, through lawyers." "Erica," I called as she reached the doorway. She turned back, hope flickering in her expression. "I'm sorry it ended this way," I said. "For both of us." She nodded and disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone in the hall where I'd just won the most Pyrrhic victory of my life. ## epilogue. The new foundation. 6 months later, I was standing in the same greenhouse where I'd first discovered my wife's betrayal. But the space had been transformed. Gone were Simon's elaborate irrigation systems and automated lighting. In their place were simple growing beds filled with vegetables that would be donated to local food banks, tended by volunteers from environmental organizations throughout the region. The Erica situation had resolved itself more quietly than I'd expected. She'd moved back to Somerville, started a small consulting business, and was slowly rebuilding her reputation through genuine work rather than social climbing. We'd divorced amicably, all things considered, with a settlement that was generous but not excessive. Simon had disappeared entirely, though Felix's contacts suggested he'd moved to Florida and was attempting to establish himself in the renewable energy sector. Patricia had made sure that his reputation preceded him, so his future schemes would face more scrutiny. The real change was in my own life. The public revelation of my family's environmental philanthropy had ended my decades of deliberate obscurity, but it had also opened doors to more meaningful work. I was now actively involved in foundation decisions, using my engineering background to evaluate projects and my newfound understanding of human nature to spot potential fraud. "Mr. Locke?" A young woman appeared at the greenhouse entrance, clipboard in hand. "The volunteers from the Coastal Conservation Alliance are here for the tour." "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be right there." I took one last look around the greenhouse, remembering the night I'd watched my marriage end through these glass walls. The space felt different now. Cleaner, more purposeful. Free of the deception and manipulation that had once flourished here. As I walked toward the house to greet the volunteers, I reflected on the lessons I'd learned about trust, love, and the complex motivations that drive human behavior. I'd been naive, certainly, but not in the way Simon and Erica had assumed. My naivety had been in believing that good intentions were enough to protect the people and causes I cared about. Now, I knew better. Protecting what mattered required vigilance, wisdom, and the willingness to act decisively when threats emerged. It required understanding that love and betrayal could coexist, that people were capable of both genuine affection and calculated manipulation, and that trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt on entirely new foundations. The volunteers were gathered on the front lawn, a mix of college students and retirees united by their commitment to environmental causes. As I approached them, I saw the future of the work I'd inherited from my grandfather, people who cared more about results than recognition, who were willing to do the hard work of making the world a better place without expecting applause or profit. "Welcome to the Locke Environmental Center," I said, gesturing toward the house and grounds that had been my family's private retreat for 3 generations. "Let me show you what we're building here, and how you can be part of it." As we walked toward the greenhouse, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the windows, a man who looked older and wiser than he had 6 months ago, someone who had learned the difference between being naive and being trusting, between being generous and being foolish. The skeleton key to understanding people, I discovered, wasn't cynicism or suspicion. It was the recognition that everyone had multiple motivations, complex desires, and the capacity for both good and evil. The key was learning to see those complexities clearly, to respond appropriately to both the light and shadow in human nature, and to protect what mattered without losing the ability to hope for better. Behind me, the house stood solid and enduring, its foundations strong enough to support whatever came next. Ahead of me, the volunteers waited to learn about the work we were doing together, their faces bright with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that couldn't be faked or bought. It was a good place to start building something new.